Welcome to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. Well, we've got to a very important song in the Sondheim canon, and I'm very excited to welcome back to the show Shannon Dohar to delve into this, and as you're about to find out, is probably the best person to have invited onto the show to talk about this particular song. There's no reason to delay it then, so let's get into my conversation with Shannon about the song Finishing the Hat.
Mademoiselles, you and me, pal. Second bottle.
Shannon Dohar, thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, we have a big song to talk about here this week.
We sure do, Kyle. We sure do. The pressure is on.
Pressure's on. Stephen Sondheim's two books of collected lyrics basically reference this very song. So we're going to break down the importance of the creation of art and how artists lose themselves. But before we get into all of that discussion, Something in the Park with George.
Yeah.
What is your backstory with this? When was the first time you became familiar with it?
This was arguably, I can't remember if the VHSs that I rented from the library first were Into the Woods or Sunday in the Park. Mm-hmm. One of my parents would have brought one of them home. And Into the Woods I liked but didn't stick when I was that young. And Sunday in the Park I immediately felt like this is too close for comfort. And I was like 7 and really pushed away from it. I was raised by a father who is a painter and has only ever been a paid artist for the entirety of my life, which is remarkable. But even at I must have been 7 or 8, I kind of felt like George Seurat, I know and love because, again, raised by an artist and was an art history minor. And once I got to college and spend a lot of time in museums, but I kind of pushed away from it when I was that young and went instead to Sondheim's Into the Woods and Sweeney and all of those. And then when we got to the 2017 revival with Jake Gyllenhaal and Annalee Ashford, I was like, all right, the time is right. At that time, I was early 30s. So about 20 years had passed. And I was yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm grown up enough now to engage with this story.
Exactly. I've lived enough life. And then it immediately became in the rotating number 2 spot of favorite Sondheims. It's such a stunner and it's so gorgeous and there's so much in it. But yeah, I had to grow up to love Sunday.
Can I ask, what kind of painter was your father?
Yeah, he does holiday cards for a card company called Kaspari. So professionally, he does a lot of Santa Clauses and Father's Day cards and really intense, beautiful oil paintings that then kind of get produced as greeting cards. But in his kind of side time, he does a lot of weird, abstract, kind of surrealist work, not abstract expressionist. It tends to be of a thing, but it also tends to be of a head in the sky with a bird, that kind of thing.
Sure, no, I get you. So you're in your 30s, you go and see this revival. What's your take on that revival? Because I based on the guests I've had, it seems a bit divisive to me, but maybe that's not the general consensus.
I think it is a little divisive. I think there was certainly, it reopened the Hudson Theater, which is this really stunning Broadway house that had been closed for a really long time. And so it was this kind of celebratory moment in the New York theater scene. I think if I were to guess at what makes it divisive, it's the Jake Gyllenhaal of it all, getting essentially a non-singer to do George. It's a real swing, and you could argue that the show doesn't need a celebrity in that role, that it's enough of a piece in and of itself. But I thought he did really beautifully. I went in with kind of no expectations and thought he was really, really wonderful. Annalee Ashford is magnificent. Robert Sean Leonard was also in that revival, who I love and will go see do anything. And he had a really beautiful bio for that revival.
By the way, we were talking about Shakespeare before we pushed record here today. He's in the Kenneth Branagh version of Much Ado About Nothing.
Yeah, he is.
Am I right? Yeah, with Denzel and everything. There's never been like 3 better looking men that put on screen
So
at the same
true.
time. It's so great.
So true. Yeah. No. So it's a very long-winded way of saying I love this revival. I think it's great. I thought it was really beautiful. I thought it was really well done. Annalie Ashford is a perfect dot. And it was a good-sized orchestra. It was really well done, really dedicated. And I thought Jake Gyllenhaal was great. So I'm pro 2017 revival.
Just taking the piece, like taking out specific performances, are there aspects of it that work better for you than others? Like, I guess what I'm asking for is like your overall stamp of this is what my feelings are on this show.
My overall stamp is that I am a fierce defender of the second act.
Great.
Which a lot of people don't love, but I think it's a masterpiece. And I think that it is as close as we get to Sondheim's statement on what it means to be a creative and what art is and what art does for people and what art takes away from people. I am very pro second act. I think you need the second act, which is probably one of my more controversial Sondheim opinions.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I'm biased, of course, but every guest I've had on this season has said the same thing about like, yes, you need the second act in order for the whole piece to really make sense.
Yeah.
I'm of the same opinion. I do believe that. But then I see all the time people are like, do you really need the second act of Sunday in the Park with George? Like, it does seem to be a recurring thing people always say.
Who are these people, Kyle?
I don't know. It's wild to me because it's like, I don't know. I feel like that position is focused only on plot and not on theme. Because if you look at the themes of what it's trying to communicate, then it's like you absolutely need that second act, or else the first act is just fine. And there's some great songs in it, don't get me wrong, but you don't get that emotional breakthrough. You don't actually get any like resolvement of any of the things that are brought up in Act 1. But that's me.
No, and you don't get the examination of being an artist in a more modern society too. You know, that the whole kind of chromaloom lead up is one of my favorite things, because again, as the daughter of an artist who would kind of wander around as a little tiny child at art openings and hear people say like ridiculous stuff and have my dad be like, okay, blazers are expensive. Like we gotta make this happen. I think you really need that.
For the 2017 revival, what was the chromaloom? Was it still like a light projection?
It was a light. It was kind of like light projecting all around.
It's interesting because the research I've done is that different major productions have done very different things with their chromolooms, which is fun. I do like that they try to incorporate what is actually currently what is avant-garde stuff.
I love that.
In the art world. So one was an interpretive dance, which I thought was interesting.
Okay.
There's the rear projection that the London one did, which was kind of cool. I figure that right now you'd be doing something with animation or something like that, like an installation piece to go into and experience and somehow show that on stage. But I'm so far outside of the art world, I don't even know what is considered avant-garde anymore.
I think it would probably be some strange, like, and then you go sit in this room and it's completely dark and there's like a spot of light in the corner and you just think about what you've done.
Hi everyone, just Kyle breaking into the conversation to tell you about some of the people that help this show continue to go. If you'd like to help support the show for absolutely free, you can give a rating and review on whatever app you listen to podcasts in. That's, of course, greatly appreciated. Putting Together is an independent podcast, so if you'd like to help monetarily, which will only help to grow and make this show better, you can do so over at our Patreon page. Please do not donate if it impacts you negatively financially. I also need to give a huge thank you to the God That's Good tier from Patreon of Jack, Todd, Robert, Louise, Christopher, Stephen, and Derek. You can go to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast to become a supporter, and you can be just like Kirk was this week, who joined us over there. So thank you so much for being our newest supporter over there, Kirk. Let's get back to the show. So, what song are we discussing here this week?
Finishing the Hat.
Yeah.
She says with fear in her voice.
Trepidation. By the end of this, I hope we do have a hat of some kind here. So yeah, this is the big George solo of Act 1. And I'm recording these all out of order, so I can't remember if I have said this or will be saying this on a future episode. But I just wanted to point out, I do in a way, when you read up on like the making of the original Broadway cast, some people are very explicit and some people talk around it about how kind of a jerk Mandy Patinkin was to work with.
Yeah.
In one aspect, I kind of agree because all of his songs were written so late into like the making of this show that it's like, well, Dot has like 3 songs she gets to sing and he had like half of a song that he gets to have. That's all to say that this is kind of the standout big moment for George in Act 1. Do you recall what is happening like right before this song starts?
Yeah, so right before we kick things off here, Dot has essentially just made the decision that she's going to leave George for Louis, the baker. And she's just sung Everybody Loves Louis. She is trying to decide whether she wants essentially like a more secure, easier, quote unquote, romantic partnership, or whether she wants, you know, there's at one point she has a line that's like, there's always Louis and there's always Georges. No, there's Louis and there's George. Like there's a unique connection that the two of them have and a unique love that the two of them have. But ultimately, like he's so checked out emotionally and he has so many walls up that she just knows that she's never going to be a true partner, and so she's just decided to go off and be with Louis.
How do you as a viewer feel about that? Like ultimately, do you think George and Dot in a perfect world could have found a way to be together, or you're like, no, good choice, Dot?
Good choice, Dot. Good choice, Dot. It's not worth it, girl. Don't do it. Like, and I get it. I really get it. And I feel for her. And I think that, you know, it's the choice may have been mistaken. The choosing is not, right? Like you have to make a call. And I think she makes the call that is ultimately gives her a more satisfying life. Does she love George forever? Yes. But I think that this is the right move for her.
The thing that is repeatedly shown throughout this first half of the show is just how much, like, yes, there is a deep love that both of them have for each other, but also you're just not giving each other what you need. Right?
Yeah.
The love cannot sustain a long-term relationship by itself. You need to nurture that, and George is not in a position to reciprocate. So yeah, she kind of has to make the decision, for my own well-being, I have to move on. We keep using pun very much intended. But it's interesting, like the more I've been delving into the lyrics, and maybe this is so obvious to everybody else, but for me, this seemed like this breakthrough that the whole first act is about Dot moving on and the second act is about George moving on. I mean, it's not the same George.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's absolutely right.
And in 2 different ways, right? One is love moving on and one is like artistically and like professionally has to move on to like get breakthrough to the next thing, which is what all of this show is wrapped up in and trying to communicate. So there's a reason why this won the Pulitzer Prize. Let's just say that.
Yeah, quite.
George, of course, is now alone. He's like thinking to himself here, and so he starts kind of muttering to himself and he sings, "Mademoiselle, you and me, pal. Second bottle. Ah, she looks for me. Bonnet flapping, yapping, rough, chicken, pastry. Yes, she looks for me. Good. Let her look for me to tell me why she left me, as I always knew she would. I had thought she understood. They have never understood, and no reason that they should. But if anybody could."
Mademoiselle, you and me, pal. Second bottle, ah, she looks for me. Bonnet flapping, yapping, roof, chicken, pastry. Yes, she looks for me. Good. Let her look for me to tell me why she left me, as I always knew she would. I had thought she understood. They have never understood, and no reason that they should. But if anybody could.
Just to start things off, that list of things that he's thinking to himself, what do we want to say about that?
If you watch the Mandy Patinkin recorded version, which you certainly should, I always think of this as an artist kind of settling in to get back to work and to try to reset what they're working on and what they're approaching. And so he's very literally saying, like, flipping through the pages and saying, right. This is what I've been doing. These are the studies that I've been working on. Right. There's a bonnet that's flapping.
These are all references to The Day Off, by the way. Like, all of these lines are coming right from that song. Mm-hmm.
And right from the paintings that he's been generating out of The Day Off.
This also brings up a point. I don't know how important this is necessarily, but this does seem to show that, well, I don't know. I guess you could still read it both ways. For The Day Off, I've always wondered, are we supposed to believe that these are actually conversations that are happening, or are they the conversations George is thinking that these characters are having? Do you have an opinion on that?
I do. I've always thought it's the latter. I think it's George just kind of sitting in the corner and imagining what all of these different people are saying to each other.
Well, I'm aligned with you on that here. So he's flipping through all these things, and then he starts to speak, as Sondheim writes in the book here too, in these kind of sentence fragments. These things are popping into his head. Anything that jumps out at you from this kind of first section?
So many things. I mean, this is the kind of internal monologue that he really hasn't written this type of thing before, where it's just thoughts kind of coming in and around a character. But I don't know if viciousness is the right word, but that's always what I think of when, yes, she looks for me, break, good. Break.
Yeah.
It's brutal.
This is such a departure, right? Like, if you, as I've been doing, going chronologically through Sondheim's work for very many reasons, one being like the terrible experience Merrily We Roll Along turned out to be, this is such a departure from what he has done beforehand. A lot of that has to do with James Lapine and their collaboration and the way that they worked together. But he mentions so many times, and you see it in the finished piece, like this song, Beautiful, the title song, like Sunday, all of these are like sentence fragments. Like they don't actually say anything, but they're so poetic, beautiful, and you communicate something, but they're not like declarative statements to build up a song. He's trying something completely different.
And it's interesting because at the same time, there are standout moments of declaration, like, yes, she looks for me, good. Where you kind of remember, depending on the version, and I think just speaking of the two that I have the most familiarity with, the original Mandy Patinkin and the 2017, Mandy Patinkin plays it more kind of like a very aloof, very kind of obnoxious, slightly awful, definitely tortured person.
Sure.
And when I saw Gyllenhaal do it, it felt a little bit more, not a psychiatrist, blah, 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 but it felt slightly like autistic. Like this was somebody who was just not able to connect with their emotions. And so even something as kind of vicious as, yes, she looks for me, good, you can kind of take in either of those directions as like, good, I'm glad that like, I am bitter and angry, and if she's gonna leave, then she should keep looking for me, because I knew she was gonna leave me. They always leave me. This is always what happens.
Oh, right. I see what you're saying. Oh, that's interesting, because I've always looked at it the kind of the opposite ways. Like, he's glad that she's looking for him, that he wants to be needed in this moment. Almost, it's like he wants her to be looking for him because he hasn't fully gone yet.
I think that's in there too, but there's certainly can also be this lens of like, again, they always leave. I knew they would, and it's the self-fulfilling prophecy where he's like building up these walls and then kind of creating a world in which nobody can emotionally connect with him.
Not to get into a pronoun debate, but I mean, this is such a great way to communicate something very simply, which is like, they have never understood, which means this has happened before. This is not the first person to leave him, which is an interesting thing, that there's been these series of women that we don't really ever find out about, but like Dot is not the first person to do this. Certainly
not. And then but if anybody could,
exactly.
There's that like, moment that he really
she was special too.
That their relationship would have been different. I always am very interested in, and no reason that they should also.
Yeah.
Even if you take the tack that George is this like aloof kind of, they always leave guy. And no reason that they should is kind of a moment of emotional vulnerability where he's saying like, who can blame these people What else are they going to do? Like, I get it. I know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a level of self-knowledge here that George is admitting to. You hope that other people, like even in a modern day context, would understand. It's like, yeah, I'm literally like spending all night by myself, not paying any attention to her, blowing off dates and everything like that. Like, of course they're going to get upset with me.
Yeah.
But the tragedy about it is like, I'm still compelled. I can't just stop doing this. I need to finish this painting.
Yeah.
That's the kind of the tragedy about the whole thing.
And that's, we have heard the phrase that's about to happen once before in the show up to this point. And it's when Dot is saying, like, the Follies, we're supposed to go to the Follies. And George says, I have to finish that. Like, no. And that's literally his response is, I have to finish that.
Well, yeah, again, and outside of so much context, like if in 2023, if a friend of mine was dating someone and you're like, yeah, we're supposed to go on this date, and then he phoned me up and said, I'm sorry, I have to finish the hat, I'd be like, what are they talking about? That is the most bonkers thing in the world to say. So to that point, George continues on by going, finishing the hat, how you have to finish the hat, how you watch the rest of the world from a window while you finish the hat, mapping out a sky, what you feel like planning a sky, what you feel when voices that come through the window go, until they distance and die, until there's nothing but sky.
Finishing the hat, how you have to finish the hat, how you watch the rest of the world from a window, while you finish the hat, mapping out a sky, what you feel like planning a sky, what you feel when voices that come through the window go, until they distance and die, until there's nothing but sky. And how you're
if it's not obvious, I think this song in particular is some of the most poetic writing that Sondheim has ever used, and I find it so evocative and sad.
It's really deeply melancholic. It's that feeling of exclusion, regardless of whether or not it's self-inflicted, that you watch the rest of the world from a window while you finish the hat, that like you cannot be a part of this thing that's happening outside, and you cannot be a part of the day off. You have to be separate from the day off and be observing.
Yeah. I think this is probably the crux of people who don't engage with this show or feel like it's just a show about a self-absorbed asshole, I guess, to put it plainly, is whether or not you've ever had the experience of being an artist or creating something. I can fully understand if people just are not tuned that way, that this does feel weird and like I don't necessarily really understand what you're trying to communicate. There's an example I've used already here this season. The recent movie The Fabelmans that was directed by Steven Spielberg, there is a scene that happens that I think kind of goes part and parcel to this, which is like his parents are basically getting a divorce in front of him and he is imagining making a movie about that very thing that's happening. He is not in the moment. He's thinking, how do I create art out of this moment? And I understand this on such a cellular level of being a part of something, but not really being a part of it. I've done this so many times, like, how can I put this into something that I want to write? Or how do I put this into something that I want to make? Rather than just being in the moment itself. I don't know if you have any, experience with that or not.
I certainly do. Kind of on both sides, honestly. So on the one hand, I have always kind of considered myself this anomaly of a creative person where, I was an English major, but I don't write fiction. I was literary analysis. I spend every moment of free time in museums. I cannot paint. I have no interest in painting. I was an art history minor. The way that I engage with art is by picking at it. And talking about it and not creating it myself. That being said, there are moments when I have been writing or podcasting or creating something where, I'll get a text that is like, oh, we're going to go do whatever. And like, I can't. I have to write. I have to write. It's not an option. And like, yes, theoretically, it would be great, but I know myself. I know the creative process. I know I'm going to have to sit here for an hour and fiddle around and do nothing. And then maybe if I'm lucky, I'll get a paragraph and then I'll sit and fiddle for another hour. It's going to be an all day thing. and I cannot engage with the world in the way that I am being asked to be a part of it in those moments. And then the flip side is, again, being raised by an artist who was very present and really showed up, but also there were certainly moments where I would be on the receiving end of, no, I have to finish the hat.
Right.
Sometimes very literally. That can be really hard to take because there's that moment of like, I'm a human person and that is art. And you're picking the art over the human person is how it can kind of feel from the other side of it. Now, as I've gotten older and maybe more artistically inclined myself, I always land on the side of like, yeah, no, you do. You have to pick the art rather than the people because the people are transient and they come and go and the art lives forever. So like, yes, actually, you do pick the art over the person. But that is a very complicated sentiment.
No, for sure. I think the thing that I attune to most is this, like, you know, planning the sky, right? He's planning on painting a sky, and you do hear the voices that are, you know, traveling through the window as people pass by and you're observing it and everything. But until they distance and die, which is such a beautiful lyric. I just like how that sounds. Again, melancholy.
Very.
And then until there's nothing but sky on your actual canvas. So you're taking the real and making a facsimile out of it, spending the whole day doing that while the rest of the world really does pass you by. I've been working on this small video project this past week, and it is wild how I was like, I'm just going to take 20 minutes and do this one thing, and then 3 hours go by. I'm like, oh my god, I just completely lost myself in like the tweaking of small changes and stuff. So that's where I get into it, is like when there's something I really want to do or really want to put a creative spin on, I can spend like 4 or 5 hours like not moving from a chair.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, why does my neck hurt? I'm like, because I've been hunched over for 5 hours.
I haven't had some water in.
Have you read Sondheim's basically like write-up of this song in Look, I Made a Hat? Yeah, it goes on for a while, but
it's one of the longest ones in the series, which it should be, because it's, you know, he named 2 books after it, so fair enough.
He understands doing this on 2 levels. Like, he wrote apparently A Little Night Music in a steakhouse for the most part, while like Frank Sinatra was playing in the background and people were having conversations. But it's like I cocooned myself. I was able to like super focus in and spend hours eating my meal while all this other stuff is happening and still create that show. He also goes on this very deep discussion of this murder mystery game that he made, which makes me really feel bad that he never released a board game, because I think he would have been a really good game designer.
Oh, he would have been amazing. It's an interesting, you know, and it does kind of remind you that art can be anything, and that he can have the same experience creating a little night music as he can like playing a murder game.
Yeah.
That's really, I think, very beautiful and very humanizing, and also, you know, in a world where we tend to think of art as something, you know, preserved for like, I don't know, intellectuals or highfalutins, and, you know, that's not true. It can just be a murder game. That also is art, actually. Murder games qualify.
Actually, this is a great point too, that I don't think we've brought up enough times during this season. Like, for sure, this show very specifically is about a painting, about a painter, like kind of like a fine art idea. But I do think that this can be transferred over to so many different, you know, mediums, if you want to say that. I was just confronted by this the other day. As someone who grew up playing a lot of video games, I know for sure that so many people back in the 80s were like, this is like such a fad, like no one's going to care about these 40 years later. I was like, no, I actually deeply care about Sonic the Hedgehog on a really weird level, that I'm sure the people even back then, like, they wanted to create a good game, but probably did not envision, 40 years later people are going to be like still obsessed by this thing, by this piece of art that we created.
No one can tell me Final Fantasy X isn't art. Sorry. Like,
true enough.
You can't do it. Like, you cannot do it. It absolutely qualifies. It absolutely qualifies.
Put that in the Louvre is what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
Or the Chicago Institute of Art, wherever this...
This one's at the Chicago Institute of Art, which is, as a New Yorker, deeply frustrating to me, but I guess I can have it. It's fine.
And so, okay, so he continues on by going, "I know you're always turning back too late from the grass or the stick or the dog or the light. How the kind of woman willing to wait's not the kind that you want to find waiting to return you to the night, dizzy from the height, coming from the hat."
And how you're always turning back too late from the grass or the stick or the dog or the light. How the kind of woman willing to wait's not the kind that you want to find waiting to return you to the night. Dizzy from the height, coming from the hat.
There's two main things that stick out to me in this collection. One is that you're always turning back too late from the grass or the stick or the dog or the light, which is such a beautiful sentiment that, you're so caught in the light of the moment that you miss everything else that's going on. But there's such a sense of grief and loss in that, like, if you ever have been trying to look for an eclipse or something in the sky or like something that's very fleeting, like a bird or an animal of some kind, and then the person that you're with is like, no, it's right there, it's right there, it's right there. Oh, you just missed it. Like, it's such a heartbreaking moment of like, you're always turning back too late, and there's such a grief in that and such a sadness in that like it is also art that you're missing out on, you could argue. And that's really devastating. And then there's the how the kind of woman willing to wait's not the kind that you want to find waiting, which is complicated.
Oh, so complicated. And but at the same time, I do understand that the sentiment that he's trying to communicate here.
100%. It wouldn't be complicated if you didn't see both sides.
Yeah, which, I mean, the positive side of this is like, I want... the woman that I want in my life, I want to have their own interiority. Like, I want them to want other things. I don't want them just to be wanting me. But yeah, at the same time, like, that's such an awful thing to offload to your partner at the same time.
Oh, it's terrible. And it's a terrible, like, again, it's that, I go back to that kind of self-fulfilling emotional barrier that George has put up, that he's saying, like, it's kind of that, like, anybody who would want to put up with this isn't that interesting to begin with, and anybody who would put up with this just isn't gonna do it. It feels a little bit like George just saying there will never be a person who can do all of these things, and therefore he will never find a person who can do all of these things.
I should point out the fact that as part of this very long write-up, Sondheim also points out the fact that there is a lyric inside this section that has always bugged him, that he could not figure out how to fix. So even though, again, he named both of his books after this very song, he's like, this is not a perfect song. There's an imperfection that has existed that bugs me to this very day. And that's the fact that he starts off this section by saying, and how you're always turning back too late. And then a few lines later, it's how the kind of woman willing to waits. So late and waits don't actually rhyme, because he has to put the S on there, because otherwise it wouldn't make grammatical sense. And he couldn't figure out another word other than late to put there. Yeah. Over time, he's like, you know what? It's just going to have to be imperfect. It bugs me, but I can't think of two better words to put in these spots.
This is why we love Steve. These kinds of sentiments are why we love Steve.
It's weird, too, because there's not really much of a rhyme scheme, I don't think, in the rest of this song. There's not one that I could, no, not really. There's things that rhyme, but there's not.
Knew
she would, they should, anybody could in the first section. Like, that's a run of times, but it usually just ends in like a rhyming couplet in a few different cases.
Or just a repetitive hat.
Yeah, it's hat. Oh, yeah. That's the other thing here too, that even before I read this little write-up, I always thought it was interesting that a hat always shows up in a bunch of Sondheim shows. Yeah. Bowler hat from Pacific Overtures.
Does anyone still wear a hat?
Thank you. I was like, I know there's like the one most famous one from Company. Like the hat motif comes up again and again and again. To Sondheim, he says, yeah, I just like the sound of the word hat.
Just I don't know. Like how hats seem.
It's like, there's no deeper meaning to this other than I just like the way that it sounds.
Listen, sometimes a hat is just a hat.
That's right. Sometimes it's just a hat. All right. Well, he continues on saying, studying the hat, entering the world of the hat, reaching through the world of the hat like a window, back to this one from that, studying the face, Stepping back to look at a face leaves a little space in the way like a window. But to see, it's the only way to see.
Studying the hat, entering the world of the hat, reaching through the world of the hat like a window. Back to this one from that, studying a face, stepping back to look at her face, leaves a little space in the way like a window. But to see, it's the only way to see. And when the
I mean, I get the recurring thing here is window. He uses window
Yeah.
a bunch of times throughout this song. Any special analysis you want to give to that idea?
This is pretty baseline, but it's just very much the transition between one world to another. And also that it is that kind of barrier of exclusion, that he's on one side watching the world while the world is actually going on outside of the window.
Yeah, it's just an interesting, like, I don't know, caught in the middle sort of thing, right? Because in the first bit, he's talking about like a literal window he's looking out of to the real world. And then this one is like the
Metaphorical
created window
window.
into a
Yeah.
different world that he is himself creating. So he's caught between these two different windows that he's going between.
Yeah, it's true. It's kind of like having a mirror in front of you and behind you, where it just kind of goes and goes and goes
Right.
and goes and
Right,
goes. And the world of the hat is also like such an evocative line, because I think part of what makes this song and the sentiment so powerful is that a hat is something so simple and can be seen as very kind of like dismissive. Like, yeah, it's a hat. Like, what do you...
Right.
But there are worlds of hats. Like, there is so much to it. And if you look at it artistically in terms of Seurat, a hat is a whole universe. Like,
Right.
you've got that pointillism, which we haven't really talked about. And, it doesn't play a big part of this song. If you were to look at a Seurat study of a hat, it could be anything. There could be anything in that hat. And it's very kind of effective, in terms of the three rules of Sondheim, right? Like, you can look at it from so many different angles, and the Seurat angle also is very effective.
I think this is just that power of the little things. Like, knowing a few different artists in my own life, I don't know how many times I've seen them sketch something out, right? It's like, I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing. And then they do a few other things. I'm like, oh my God, that's even more amazing. And then they do 3 more things. I'm like, oh my God, this is like so amazing. So it's like, I've been perfectly fine like 3 versions ago. And you've just improved because you just added slightly different things, like a shadow here, or this thing over here, or like a little, I don't know, freckle here on the hand that you're drawing and stuff like that. And I think on the outside, it's like, it's just a hat. Who cares? And it's like, no, I need to get this right, or else the whole painting is off.
You have to finish the hat. Really, you have to finish the hat. There is also this declaration that the distance is the only thing that allows him to observe, but to see, it's the only way to see. That again plays into that either George is kind of a dick, or he is somebody who is like really struggling with his emotional world. That there is the question of like, is this the only way that he can actually create art? Is to be at a distance, and is to remove himself from the world at large, and to observe, and to kind of be separate and be in between those windows and those panes of glass? Or is he insisting that he has to because he's decided to be difficult?
I guess, that's the question here. I think oftentimes, I won't say this is an every time sort of thing. I think the artists who do, span the generations or the centuries or something like that really were those observers who cut themselves off and were difficult to deal with and were kind of temperamental. This is probably why that proliferation of like, you have to be a tortured artist in order to make good art, which I don't agree with, but I understand why it has like sustained itself over the years, because if you want to make something truly like revolutionary and great, you're going to push people away to make that. And so I guess you have to yourself, do you want to make the best art, or do you want to have functional relationships in your life? And sometimes that is the choice.
Yep. Sure is. Yeah, I mean, I think like that. I completely agree. I don't think you need to be tortured to be a great artist, but also like I get it because there is that argument that to truly create and to truly kind of make a statement on what's going on in the world, you cannot be a part of it, and that has repercussions.
The line that has always stood out to me is like, back to this one from that. Like, again, such a simple way to communicate that, and then rhymes with hat as well. So it is really leaning far into like, I'm in a trance, and sometimes I have to pull myself out of that to kind of, again, go back into my observation mode, to go back into my obsession.
Probably.
So this is how George ends his entire song off. He goes, and when the woman that you wanted goes, you can say to yourself, well, I give what I give. But the woman who won't wait for you knows that however you live, there's a part of you always standing by, mapping out the sky, finishing a hat, starting on a hat, finishing a hat. Look, I made a hat where there never was a hat.
And when the woman that you wanted goes, you can say to yourself, well, I give what I give. But the woman who won't wait for you knows that however you live, there's a part of you always standing by, mapping out the sky, finishing a hat, starting on a hat, finishing a hat. Look, I made a hat where there never was a hat.
And we all applaud him for finishing that hat.
I mean, the thing is, like, I think about what you were saying with the kind of lack of declarative statements in a lot of this piece. But at the same time, like, there is no stronger declarative statement than, look, I made a hat where there never was a hat. And like that sense of accomplishment when, you know, we were talking about our own creative processes, like all of the times that I had to say like, no, I can't, I have to stay home and write. And then I finished the piece and I'm like, look, I made a hat. Like, there is never a hat there before. And now there's a hat there. Like, that's amazing that it is this like really celebratory, beautiful moment of like, yeah, you made that hat. Look at, there wasn't a hat there before. Now there is. And there's, you know, the children and art of it all, like that now there is this permanent thing in the world that is there because you put it there. But again, that it comes with consequences, and however you live, there's a part of you always standing by and not engaged.
Yeah, I think both of those things are such a powerful things to like ruminate on. One, it's like, it is something to be celebrated, to be like, you actually just made something. You're like, isn't that cool that you just made something? I mean, there's a film podcast I listened to where it kind of started off as a joke, but has become something that they actually do mean. Because for even movies that they hate, they end every review as like, isn't it great that blank director made a movie? Like, it is kind of crazy to think that they were able to actually get this across the finish line. Yeah. And I think that's true for all artists. It's like, whether I hate it or love it, doesn't really matter. It's like, you made something, though. That is something more than what a lot of other people have been able to do. The flip side of that is that, yes, the you know, dagger to the heart statement that he makes here is like, there's this woman and then there's these relationships that I want to pursue and like give myself over to, but no matter how much of I give myself to them, there's always this part of me that's not there. That's just not engaged with it, that I'm off in the clouds or looking at something, or how can I bring this into the creations I'm doing? It is like, really, when you break this down, I find this I think I said this at the very beginning, like such a sad, melancholy song. It is. At the end of it. Like, I do feel for George, even though I think he can be rightly criticized in certain ways that he conducts himself.
Could not agree more. And that sense of permanence also, I think, is really beautifully put in finishing a hat, starting on a hat, finishing a hat, that it's just like, it's endless. It will always be. There will always be a hat to work on.
I think that's the other big thing about artists too, is that it really is, you're never really done. It's not like, well, I made a painting and I never have to do that again. It's like, well, now I start the next one.
Look at what we were saying about Sondheim always regretting wait and late, not rhyming. Like, you know, there is this kind of constant artistic push to make something better and to keep fiddling and to keep working, whether it's on edits to the same piece or something new. And I feel for the character of George very much. I think that, you know, whether or not it's self-fulfilling and whether, you know, it's all a matter of interpretation. And I think fundamentally this is a person who wants to connect and doesn't know how, except for in a way that is like fundamentally removed from other living people in his life. And that is always going to be devastating.
The meta aspect of this, though, I think is a little bit fascinating. Again, part of this big write-up, Sondheim tells this story about Leonard Bernstein's musical Mass, and how ultimately they were considering doing some cuts to it to make it like a tighter piece. But Bernstein was like, no, leave it the long and shaggy version it is, because I like the imperfections. Sondheim leaves imperfections in his mind, imperfections into this song. Yet the song is about a guy obsessing over perfection. So I think that's kind of fascinating too, because when I think about a lot of stuff that I love, not everything, but a lot of like the films or books or whatever, there is this element of imperfection that is why I like the thing, where it's like, yeah, like maybe the special effects don't hold up anymore, but that's kind of why I like it. Or it's like, actually you can see like the whatever, like is this like a perfectly written piece? No, but they get the emotion right, and that's enough for me to love this thing as much as I do. I mean, using Merrily is a great example of this. Is that a good show? Well, I mean, the music's great. I wouldn't call it a great show, though, at the end of the day. But that's kind of why I like it too, is that there is this imperfection to it that draws me in and makes me want to engage with it even more.
This is why I love listening to composers sing their own work, because they're rarely great.
Yeah.
Like, and you know, Steve was kind of famously reticent to sing, but there's a couple of recordings. He does a couple on the Anyone Can Whistle score.
They take his like backers auditions and then put them on there.
Like, I love listening to. They're not great. I don't care. I think they're so impactful and so beautiful, because I love hearing his like very imperfect voice portraying this thing that he made that is arguably perfect. And I think like that's another version of what we're talking about too.
I mean, to keep it in like the Broadway example here, or the musical example, like Sending the Clowns is like the perfect thing to do here. Is like, Glynis Johns, I actually do like her voice, but like she's not like an amazing singer. I think that song in particular is actively worse if you do get a great singer into it. You need that person who is almost straining to get it out. Yeah,
it's like this is a different composer, but it's the Sally Bowles thing, where you can't actually have a great singer play Sally. It's not ideal.
And if I knew George Seurat maybe a little bit more than I do, maybe there isn't an example in this painting or one of his other ones where an imperfection makes it even better.
I mean, you could argue that like pointillism in and of itself is like all about this kind of meta imperfection turning itself into perfection, because if you zoom in, it doesn't look like anything, and then you zoom out and it's this like stunning piece. So you could kind of make that argument. I like Seurat. I'm not like a super fan. I think I like him mostly because of Sunday in the Park with George, rather than because of pointillism. Like, I kind of could dig early pointillism. I think it's interesting artistically, and I think like that it does some cool stuff, but ultimately I love Seurat because I will always stop in front of a Seurat because of this piece, not because necessarily of George Seurat himself.
For me, it's all about the monkeys. That's why this piece works. So when you take a look at the entire score of Sunday in the Park with George, finishing that, is that top 3, middle 3, bottom 3? Like, where would it go into your rating of the entire score?
Top 3. Definitely top 3. I don't know that it's my favorite piece from this score. I don't know that I could pick a favorite piece from this score, though. I think because of my own personal upbringing, Children at Art will always be a really intense and beautiful piece for me. So if I had to pick a favorite song from Sunday, it's probably going to be Children at Art. But Finishing the Hat is an absolute stunner and a masterpiece, and, you know, top 3 of all things.
Yeah, this is top 3 for me as well. There's basically 4 songs that on any given day kind of fight for the top position for me. It just really depends on my mood. But it's this song, We Do Not Belong Together, Move On, and putting it together, because I really like listening to that song. I like the way that it culminates at the very, very end. But, here's 4 perfect things. Take your pick. You're not going to have a bad time.
Exactly. Like, pick one of the following beautiful masterpieces. Like, it's all good. It's all going to be great.
Yeah, it's like you're not going to have a bad time. The final question I've been asking everyone here this season is maybe a hard question to answer. But, this show, of course, based on a painting, which is kind of an odd thing to base an entire musical about, but is there anything that you can think of, something odd that you would want to see adapted and turned into a musical?
Well, I had an answer that was a little bit like tortured, that I was like, I guess I'll go with that one. But over the course of our conversation, I think actually let's have a musical based on a video game.
Oh,
that'd be cool.
Has that ever happened yet?
I don't know, but I'd be down. I think that could be really interesting.
Which video game are you pitching? Pac-Man the musical.
Pac-Man the musical, definitely. I'm looking over at my collection. I don't know. Maybe one of the Ni no Kunis. Maybe. I mean, a Final Fantasy would have to be 3 days long. I was
gonna say you're turning that into like a 7-hour opera.
Exactly.
In fact, there is one video Final Fantasy, and there might be actually multiple ones where you actually have to go to an opera house.
There's Persona 5. You have to do that too.
By the way, I'm just going to pitch right now that there should be a song in the Pac-Man musical called 3 Ghosts, 2 Cherries, 1 Up.
Hell yes. See, it writes itself.
It basically writes itself. That is a very fascinating thing. Like, do you think there are certain ones, especially ones that are more plot-based?
Yeah, totally.
But I'm actually curious why they haven't tried to make something, and maybe they have, I'm just not aware of them, but something that you could definitely sink your teeth into a little bit more. I'm always a Zelda person, so I'd want to see a Zelda musical and see what that even
That'd
would
be fun. I feel like we've just hacked. I mean, The Last of Us is arguably the first good adaptation of a video game into anything else. So
right.
We might have a way to go before we can get to musical.
Otherwise, we might get into a Spider-Man turn off the dark situation. And
yeah, we don't need that.
We all don't need that. I will always remember the Tony Awards, because I was so weird that they made them do this, but where Bono and The Edge had to come out and apologize.
So weird.
We're very sorry to the community. I'm like, what is happening?
It's so bizarre.
Why are you apologizing to me? Apologize to the people that were being injured.
Somebody just broke their leg. Say you're sorry to that guy. Come on.
Shannon, thank you so much for this. This has been really fun. If people wanted to stay in contact, see what you're up to, what is the best way to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on primarily on Instagram these days, although I keep up my Twitter. Both handles are at SDohar, SDOHAR. But primarily, I have a podcast about musical theater called So Much Stuff to Sing that you can also certainly check out. You can find us wherever you get this fine podcast, and that's, again, So Much Stuff to Sing.
This is coming out actually pretty quickly. So on May 24th, the episode, do you know what the episode's going to be?
So we actually just completed our 4th annual Sondheim celebration.
Nice.
We do a mini series each year around Steve's birthday. And this year I selected the theme of murder ballads. So we did 4 Sondheim murder ballads. Exclusively from Sweeney and Assassins. Assassins fights out with Sunday for my favorite second piece often. And so, yeah, check that out. If you're curious about murder ballads, then pay us a visit.
Which I always am. So this is great.
Who doesn't love a good murder ballad?
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. You can send emails to puttingittogetherpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow Sondheim Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. This is an independent production, and you can support the show on Patreon by going to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Putting Together is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere you can get podcasts from. Consider subscribing so that you never miss an episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about We Do Not Belong Together. And no, we're not talking about my relationship with dairy. As always, a big thank you to the great Chris Taniguchi, who designed the podcast artwork, and to Nick Driscoll for composing our theme music. Well, we've reached the end of our episode. Yes, I know. Goodbye for now.